Nebraska football began in 1890. They played 2 games, won both, and were not scored upon. It was a fabulous start to what would become one of the best college football teams in the nation. Why 1890? What was going on and what happened then that Nebraska decided to start a football team? That's what I'll discuss in this video. 1890, Nebraska football begins. Now, to get to 1890, we first need to understand what happened in the years before that. So Nebraska became a state in 1867, 2 years after the end of the American Civil War. On February 15, 1869, the state legislature asked to establish the University of Nebraska, and it was approved. According to the Sombrero Yearbook from 1884, the first term of school opened on the first Thursday in September 1871. 70 students were present. There were 5 faculty members, a chancellor, a reverend in charge of English literature, another in charge of mathematics, another natural science, and one more for ancient and modern languages. The photo is of the University of Nebraska in 1871. The large building is University Hall. Notice how bleak that is, and also note that Arbor Day was started in Nebraska in 1872. Thank God. The University of Nebraska is, it's starting up. It's on its way to becoming a fine university, and it is gathering enrollment. James E. Sherwood, in the book Nebraska Football, The Coaches, the Player Experience, states, as early as 1883, the student newspaper, the Hesperian, had launched the drive to start a football team, proclaiming, "If a football team could be formed, we might in years to come have enough college enthusiasm to designate ours a real college and not a gathering place for those who do not know what a live college should be." The Hesperian is basically the student newspaper. It's the Daily Nebraskan before it's called the Daily Nebraskan, and it wasn't called the Daily Nebraskan until 1904. By 1890, the University of Nebraska had 500 students enrolled, and it was ready for competition. But before we're going to get to that, we're going to go back in time again and discuss what college football has been doing. In 1869, the first college football game, that's at least the first one that's recognized, is played between Princeton and Rutgers. And the truth of the game was really more rugby than anything we know of football as it looks now. And it had 25 players on a side. It literally was nothing like the football you know today. From 1869 to 1890, there were many changes to make the game closer to the football we know today. There were new rules created. There are 2 rules that you need to know that are really the primary rules, more important than all of the other ones. I might do another video on the early makings and, those stages in football, but we'll see how this one gets supported and how it goes and if people find it interesting, and maybe I'll go back and do some more. But the 2 rules that you need to know about are the line of scrimmage and the concept of downs. The line of scrimmage established the concept of possession in football. Honestly, previous to that, nobody really knew what the idea of possessions were. Remember that early football is really based upon rugby. And when you're tackled in rugby, you must kind of release the ball. You just kind of fumble it. And the tackler and the guy who tackled him can't just pick it up again. They're supposed to roll away from it or, kind of get away from it. And then whoever wants, whatever team, gets to go get the ball and pick it up. And I honestly confess that I don't remember rugby as well as I should. I had friends who played in the Nebraska club rugby team when I was in college. They talked me into joining, I think about 4 times. But then I sobered up. And I remembered that the Lincoln Rugby Club had some enormous 300-pound guys playing for them, and I wanted no part of that. whatsoever. It was one of the wisest decisions I've ever made in my life. The parties were good though, so hey Zulu warrior and all that. Let's move on. Back to the line of scrimmage. It allowed the play to stop. It allowed the players to gather themselves and get ready for another play. So rather than rugby where you kind of fumble the ball, somebody picks it up and it just keeps going and going, the line of scrimmage kind of established that no, we're going to stop. The play is down, the play is done. We're going to stop, gather at the line of scrimmage, and do it again. And then the concept of downs was important because it established chain of possession. Previously, there weren't any rules about possession, and honestly, there were some games played where people just hung on to the ball. They would just possess the ball to begin the game, and they would just run the ball and not really make any attempt to score. And their purpose in doing this was to keep the other team from getting the ball at all and being able to score. And in that way, they considered themselves as having won the game in some kind of bizarre, well, we don't think of it that way today, but that's how they thought of it. So the whole concept of downs was there to make sure that teams didn't just hold on to the ball. Because if they did, they just ran plays over and over, scrimmage plays, and everyone got bored to death and angry and decided that wasn't any fun. So the down concept, back then it took 3 plays to get 5 yards, and if you didn't get the 5 yards, you had to turn the ball over to the other team, either by a turnover on downs that we're familiar with now, or by basically punting or kicking the ball. And keep in mind it was illegal then to throw a forward pass. So 1869, and then football starts spreading across the country. It kind of starts in the Northeast with primarily Ivy League teams, Yale and Harvard, probably the most famous teams early on. And then it starts to spread to the Midwest. So Michigan starts playing football in 1879, Minnesota in 1882, Iowa's 1 year ahead of Nebraska at 1889, Northwestern's at 1882. The first game in Ohio was between the Miami of Ohio and Cincinnati in 1888, while in the Dakotas, South Dakota anyway, the first game is played in 1889. Missouri and Kansas both start in 1890, so you can see that the schools all around us are beginning football teams, and Nebraska is sitting there wondering, I'm sure the students are sitting there wondering, when is it our turn? So in 1890, Nebraska is still settling in as a state. In the western half of the state, the Lakota Sioux had been forced, the Native Americans had been forced onto reservations in South Dakota. And if you know your history, at the end of 1890, the Wounded Knee massacre takes place at the end, or in late 1890. There is a 600-page book in the public domain entitled The History of Western Nebraska and Its People, published in 1921. It is full of stories of just the Panhandle, 600 pages about the Panhandle and how it was kind of founded, the counties and everything. There's stories about cowboys and vigilantes and people being hung and rustlers, and one of my favorite stories in it, I haven't read all of it, it's 600 pages for crying out loud, but one of my favorite stories in it is about how 3 people died at a dance one night. One was drunk and shot himself. Another died because he got into an altercation and one of them was shot. And then another one was apparently shot dead just because. And the third, when they killed, the third one was killed, they finally broke up the dance they were having, in an orgy, as it mentions. And they quit for the night. And then the next morning they took all 3 of the cowboys up to Boot Hill and buried them in the cemetery. And there's no names mentioned of anybody's killed, but it's a 600-page book that it gives you an idea of what the world is like in 1890. On one side you have urbanization, education, and European civilization taking over, and on the other side you have a wild state full of lawlessness. And it was, you just think that it was a rough time to be alive. So why was 1890 the year Nebraska started football? Well, first of all, it was time. You know, the states around us, the colleges around us are starting their own football programs. That and a man arrived at Nebraska who knew the rules, knew how to teach the game, and he had a football. All three important factors in trying to start a football team. Dr. Langdon Frothingham. Frothingham came from Harvard, and he taught in Nebraska. He taught agriculture and bacteriology. And he had been exposed to football at Harvard. Like I mentioned earlier, Harvard's one of the big players in college football at the time. So you have a guy that has a ball, and that guy knew football, and more importantly, he's a teacher, and he knows how to teach. So he knows how to show our students and the guys that are interested in playing football how to play the game. He sounds like a guy you instantly make the coach, and he's never really named as the coach, but he is recognized as the first coach in Nebraska football. This is the 1890 Nebraska football team. A rather dashing group of young fellows, one might say. This is another shot of the team on a field with players identified. In the back row is Skiles, Mockett, a captain, Chandler, Hyde, Anderson, Stroman, Porterfield, and Troyer as a manager. In the front row, Gerard, Dr. Frothingham appears to be wearing a bowler hat, Lord, Morrow, Stockton, and Johnston. Note that they are wearing canvas suits with no padding. For 11 suits, it costs $36 total. So it was from there, Nebraska went to Omaha to play the Omaha YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, on November 27th, 1890, Thanksgiving. It was a game Nebraska won 10-0. The headline of November 28th, 1890 in the Omaha Bee was Lincoln Scores a Victory. And the subheadline was A Thrilling Game of Football at the Ballpark. The Omaha Bee was a newspaper in Omaha from 1871 to 1927 when it merged with another newspaper to become the Omaha Bee News. And in 1937, it was sold by Randolph Hearst to the Omaha World Herald, thus ending its circulation. Its history is much richer and it's much more controversial than that, but that history is outside the purview of this video. The article stated that the contest was about as rough and tumble as an affair as an outdoor sport could possibly be. The crowd in attendance was extremely partisan and quite large. For the University of Nebraska, it was partisan. It was a stubbornly fought battle from start to finish, and notwithstanding its one-sidedness, was intensely exhilarating. And an account from the Omaha World Herald stated that there were around 500 students accompanying the 12-man squad. The Omaha Bee reported that it was played under collegiate rugby rules. Now think about that for a moment. There's 500 people at this game. That means 500 students or 500 people would have had to make the trip from Lincoln to Omaha. You'd take that for granted today. But we have cars and we have highways, and this is 1890, and they have like horses and trains. So you think they would have had to have some kind of special arrangement for trains? I would guess. That's where I'm going. But it's still a feat in logistics all by itself. The Omaha World Herald reported, it was the first game of rugby football that has been seen in Omaha, and there were several hundred people out to see the boys and enjoy themselves, break each other's shins. The game resembled the old-fashioned game of log heap more than anything else. When one of the players secured the ball, he immediately proceeded to fall down, and the rest fell over him. The scene presented an animated mass of arms and legs, from the midst of which the ball was rescued, only to be the nucleus of another, quote, log heap, unquote. And the article concluded, the game was declared over and the combatants retired to nurse their bruised shins and try to make their hats fit the bumps which adorned their heads. So Nebraska wins the first game of its existence, 10-0. And you kind of get the idea from reading the game recap. I mean, you can go read the game recaps on Wikipedia. They're kind of boring in that sense. And if you read the game recaps in the newspapers in those times, well, they're also boring too, but you get the idea that YMCA really didn't know how to play football, and Nebraska kind of did. Nebraska plays their second game against Doane, and at this point they're referred to as the Old Gold Knights. And they win the game against Doane 18-0 or 18-0. And it's played on February 14, Valentine's Day, 1891. And if you're thinking, why do they call it 1890 season when it's played in 1891? And really kind of the answer to that is they really kind of were the same team, and the concept of seasons didn't exist. So you have to throw out a lot of what you think about football now and just throw it out the window because it doesn't exist yet at that time. The student newspaper, the Hesperian's account relates, "We were met at the depot by several Doane students and a few of the most portly football players. They had rolled in the mud, and their appearance struck many of our faint hearts with terror as we gazed upon their ungainly figures." The game recap mentions passing the ball, but you should take this as a rugby pass, which is more of a flip of the ball or kind of a basketball chest pass backwards. It's not a forward pass because that's illegal. And look at the ball, and you conclude that it's kind of roundish and it's not at all shaped like a football is today. You realize you're not gripping that thing like Joe Montana and throwing it down the field. You're not throwing it anywhere. The Doane Owl newspaper reported on 20th of February 1891, "The Doane team has no occasion to be discouraged over its defeat, for considering that no one in the school had ever seen a football game, and that it was thus almost purely theoretical, the game was as well contested one. It has acted as an educational factor, showing to the Doane team its weak points, upon which to work in the future. Some of the players need to change their positions and all need to practice. The team does not yet work together as a unit. Many individual plays of brilliancy were made, but they were ineffective unless backed by good teamwork." And then the recap also included some stray points of the game, kind of like just notes on the game. And it says, "Not a man was disabled on either side." This is important given the violence of the game of the day. "The university team are gentlemen and perfect good nature characterized the entire game. White uniforms in Nebraska mud make a great combination." There's the thing with the mud again. "The Doane team needs some experienced man to coach them. Oh, that such a person would locate in Crete." Nebraska is clearly in favor here because they have this guy that came from Harvard and has a ball, and he knows how to play, and he knows the rules, and he knows how to coach. And then the recap goes on to tell about how there was a reception after the game and everybody was received, and how a speech was made by G.W. Green on mud. I don't know what, is this those Doane people with their mud issues? I don't know. Crete? Is there something about mud in Crete? Because at first I thought it was the student newspaper just being silly, and then I read about it in other accounts in like the Omaha papers. So it wasn't just a joke in the student newspaper, the thing about the mud. Note this replica of a game ticket from the book Nebraska Football Vault by Mike Babcock. It's an excellent book with all sorts of artifact replicas. You can probably pick it up used on Amazon or someplace. The Hesperian's account of the game contains the game recap, along with a lively story of the team trying to get back to Lincoln. Train doesn't show up, so they stay in the depot till they find a freight train. So the team talks the brakeman into stopping another train for them, and clearly it is a passenger train. And they get on board the train, and the account continues. "Then began a chapter of tumult and confusion. Songs and yells filled the panic-stricken passengers with horror and nightmare. The brakeman abandoned the caboose and took refuge with the engineer. When we arrived in Lincoln, our hearts were made glad when we saw the band and a large number of students waiting to welcome us home. For 2 hours and a half, our loyal friends and students stood in the cold, expecting our delayed train. Surely when we see our efforts appreciated like this, we are encouraged." And the account concludes, Professor Frothingham, instructor in bacteriology, has resigned his position in order to accept one in the Harvard Medical School. He won many friends during his short connection with the university. To him, the football team owes much of its success. As a result of his careful instruction, no team has ever been able to score a point against our boys. Frothingham's hiring was announced in the Hesperian on October 1st, 1890. His resignation was announced on March 1st, 1891. He basically spent 6 months in Nebraska, and he began the football team and taught them how to play. He left Nebraska to spend the next 3 years in Germany, not Harvard Medical School. But he taught at Yale and then at Harvard, and he passed away at home in 1935. A biographical sketch I found of Frothingham stated, Frothingham must be counted as the pioneer American veterinary pathologist, since his contributions began in the 19th century at a time when no other veterinarian was specializing in this field. To understand how far ahead of his time Frothingham was, it is necessary to recall that he reported on 2 fungus diseases of animals in an era when medical mycology was in its infancy. He was a scientist of the first order and an original investigator with an imaginative mind. Now, honestly, I don't know what mycology is, but it sounds damned impressive, doesn't it? I mean, he was a scientist of the first order. He was ahead of his time. You know, this sounds like this is a guy who spent 6 months in Nebraska. And it's clear from the recaps of both games that Nebraska they understood the game. They understood how to play, and they played much better than their opponents. And I want you to consider this. You know, maybe it was destiny that Dr. Frothingham came to Nebraska. What if our guys would have been whipped in the first 2 games? What would have become of our beloved Huskers over the decades? I mean, when you start doing something and you're good at it, you think to yourself, hey, maybe I'm good at this, and maybe I should keep doing it. And if you completely fail, a lot of people will look at that and go, well, maybe I suck at this, and maybe I should stop doing it. But if you think about it, Nebraska really came into the 1890 season, played 2 games, won them easily, beat the snot out of their opponents, and didn't let them score. And that really sets the stage for all the decades to come. If this guy hadn't have shown up, what would have become of Nebraska football? I am John Johnston, Corn Nation. I hope you enjoy this episode in which I talked about the 1890 Nebraska football team, the beginning of Nebraska football. Please subscribe to this channel and like this video so that YouTube likes me more. I plan to do more of these story-based, historical type videos. I plan to get better at this. I'm trying hard. I would appreciate your support, kind of like, you know, the football team showing up in the middle of the night and having people waiting for them. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors. You can also support us by going to cobbycorn.com and picking up a Corn Nation t-shirt or hoodie. Thank you for your support so far, and thank you for watching. Go Big Red.